Chào mừng mọi người đến với tập hôm nay của Focus Việt Nam Podcast. Hôm nay thì có Chí, anh Vũ với lại Phú, và cũng cùng với một khách mời khá là đặc biệt. Thì hôm nay chúng ta có giáo sư Eddy Malesky, tiến sĩ ngành kinh tế chính trị quốc tế, giảng dạy và đồng thời là giám đốc của Trung tâm Phát triển Đức Center tại Đức University. Giáo sư cũng là một chuyên gia đã nghiên cứu lâu năm trong ngành phát triển kinh tế cũng như là kinh tế chính trị Việt Nam. Vào năm 2012 thì giáo sư được Phòng Thương mại và Công nghiệp Việt Nam trao tặng huy chương vì những đóng góp cho sự phát triển kinh tế trong vai trò là trưởng nhóm nghiên cứu dự án chỉ số năng lực cạnh tranh cấp tỉnh Việt Nam VCCI do cơ quan viện trợ phát triển quốc tế Hoa Kỳ USAID tài trợ. Trong tập này thì tụi mình sẽ trò chuyện với giáo sư bằng tiếng Anh với những cái chủ đề liên quan xung quanh về Việt Nam, văn hóa Việt Nam, các lợi thế cạnh tranh cũng như là những lĩnh vực mà Việt Nam có thể tiếp tục cải thiện và phát triển thêm nữa để giúp cho nền kinh tế Việt Nam phát triển hơn trong tương lai. Thì sau đây là cuộc trò chuyện giữa Focus Việt Nam Podcast với giáo sư Malesky.
Vietnam has this great, very talented workforce that's highly literate. Like, I think Vietnam's literacy rate is 97% right now. And that's been really good for early development. But businesses that are coming in now that are more interested in more technological production, higher value-added production, higher quality workers that were able of doing those higher level tasks. That's sort of the dimensions that they're looking at is sector specific, infrastructure, human capital, and then the final one is the governance dimension of it.
The growth model of China, when they call themselves the factory of the world, right? China have been doing kind of similar activities, and they do a lot of high-tech manufacturing. They do a lot of, and that's the engine for their growth.
Vietnam is more dependent on foreign investment than China ever was. One thing that Vietnam has not done that China had already started to do was develop champions of its own, domestic Vietnamese companies that were capable of exporting and competing. Vietnam is still very much a foreign investor-driven economy, and Vietnamese policymakers are aware of that. But right now, Vietnam is heavily dependent on foreign exporters that way.
You speak Vietnamese to Vietnamese people?
Oh, học Vietnam 20 năm rồi mà.
Oh, wow.
Yes, yeah.
Tiếng Việt giỏi quá.
Yeah, học lâu rồi. Học lùi lắm nhưng mà học lâu rồi. Và khi làm việc phải làm việc bằng tiếng Việt.
Oh, well.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the latest episode of Forward Vietnam podcast. Today we have three co-hosts, Vũ, Chí, and Phú. And we are on today with a very special guest, Dr. Eddy Malesky of Duke University. So to start off, Dr. Malesky, would you mind introducing to the audience your background and what's your relationship with Vietnam?
Oh, sure. Yeah, so I am professor of political economy at Duke University, and I'm also the director of the Duke Center for International Development. Yeah, I've been studying Vietnam for it's 27 years now. I first arrived in Vietnam in 1997 as a Luce scholar, and then became very interested. It was such an early time in Vietnam. It was a fantastic time to see the economic reforms there. Became interested in Vietnam and then continued to study it. I think what people know me most about in Vietnam is something called the Provincial Competitiveness Index. Gives me my 15 minutes of fame every year. It's a ranking of the business environments of Vietnamese 63 provinces based on a survey, 10,000 businesses. And we study things like the transparency of the business environment, even questions about corruption and informal charges. I've been working on it with a great team at the Vietnamese Chamber of Commerce and Industry and a lot of great context in Vietnam that helped me learn.
Thank you so much for the introduction. So let's get started with the first question that we are curious about when we first know you. What was the moment of the projects or the task that sparked the light about researching into Vietnam and Southeast Asian market that interesting you and keep you along with this market?
Yeah. So as I said, when I first got to Vietnam in 1997, I was this thing called a Luce Scholar. It was paid for by the Henry Luce Foundation, so founder of Time Warner Magazine, and it sends people to work in Asia. And I was working at the National Economics University in Hanoi at the time. And just, I was straight out of school. And at that time, there was a Swedish funded project that had created Hanoi's first business school. And what they were doing was training Vietnamese to do their MBAs abroad, and then they would come back to the US and teach in the program. But what was happening was you had all these young MBAs that had studied in the US that spoke really great English. And instead of, the idea was that they would teach at the school, but they became very attractive to a whole bunch of companies, and they started to go work for Coca-Cola or for other companies that were doing work in Vietnam. And so they brought out a consultant, and his plan at the time was to develop a consulting project that would allow those MBAs to earn money and still be able to stay at the school, because the foreign companies were offering so much more than National Economics University. So I was working at National Economics University, and the consultant there asked me to teach statistics as part of a statistics for marketing class to state-owned enterprises. And he paired me with a young economist from National Economics University, a guy named Nguyen Van Tang, who went on to become one of Vietnam's most famous economists and my really good friend. And Tang and I would basically travel all over the country to teach statistics to Vietnam Post and Telecom, Vinachem, so all these state-owned enterprises, because all of these state-owned enterprises were trying to learn at that time how the market worked, how they can compete in the market sector. And it ended up having this huge influence on me because, first of all, I got to see economic reform happening and these businesses trying to learn how the market worked, which was really interesting to me as I was interacting with the leaders of these companies. But the second thing is I got to see the tremendous regional variation in Vietnam, like a very clear way. I got to see not just that the differences between South and North, but the differences between all of the provinces, what Binh Duong province was like at that time, what Dong Nai province was like at that time. It just left me with some deep interest in the variance, the difference in entrepreneurship all over the country, which is what got me inspired to start to work on those questions as part of my own research. And in fact, when I think about what led to the PCI, I think a lot of the origins of the PCI can be found there. There, I was looking at that regional variation. I was teaching people how to do surveys. I was showing people how to analyze the statistics of surveys. And at the end of the day, that's really what the PCI is. It's a set of surveys and statistical analysis to measure the different aspects of governance across the country. Yeah. So anyway, so then I went back to Duke University and then I started my PhD and I came back to Vietnam. And as a graduate student, I was working there and I was trying to study the different foreign investment environments around the country. And I was given an opportunity by the Asia Foundation to create the index. And so I went to work with the Vietnamese Chamber of Commerce and Industry to develop the methodology for the PCI. Yeah, so that was about 2004, and we've been doing it every year since.
So for the listeners who didn't have a economic background, and didn't know what PCI is, can you explain to us in layman terms what PCI is? And then I know that you rank the provinces in Vietnam based on scores. So then what does it represent? And does a high score mean they are competitive or they have growth prospect, or how do we interpret the comparison?
Right. So the PCI is made up of 10 sub-indices, and those sub-indices are entry costs. So how long does it take to register and start a business and how costly is that process? Land access, so property rights, how easy is it to secure a land title and how safe is that land title over time, right? Do you feel secure on the land you're investing in, or are you worried that that land might be taken from you? The third one is regulatory costs. So how often do you have to shut down your business for inspections? How much time do you spend complying with regulations? The fourth one is transparency, access to basic business information. Can you access the budget? Can you access land use plans? Can you access infrastructure plans as a way of figuring out, is this a transparent place where you can project into the future? The fifth one is informal charges. So we look at corruption, how much firms are paying in terms of bribes, how costly those bribes are. The sixth one is the dynamism of provincial leaders. And then we also look at, in addition to that, we look at business services that provinces provide, labor fairs, business partner matchmaking. Then we look at the quality of labor and the training of labor, and then finally legal institutions. And so all of these, the better you do on them, the better the business environment is, the easier it is to be successful in your business. And each of them are scored on a 1 to 10 point scale. So we take the surveys of businesses, we ask them, we scale this to a 10 point scale, and then create a 100-point index. And so every year there's a ranking of the provinces over time, which ones are the easiest and the best places to do business, and which ones are the worst. And over time, it's become really successful in the sense that local provincial leaders use it as a way to improve. Almost every province in Vietnam has an action plan that they create talking about how they're going to improve their scores. A lot of domestic businesses use it to advocate for change. Foreign businesses use it as a way to locate business operations. And the central government has even used it in terms of cadre evaluation and promotion as which leaders are doing the best. So yeah, it's been a fascinating ride with that index. The reason we created it was because at the time that it was made, Vietnam had the enterprise law in 2000 and had a bunch of good laws on the books, but the implementation across the provinces was very different. And the biggest complaint that provinces, individual firms had was that provincial leaders were interpreting laws in different ways. So we created the index as a tool, and it's caught on. The really neat thing is that, now the index has been replicated in a bunch of other countries. So you see the index being used in Malaysia, Indonesia, El Salvador, Kosovo, Bangladesh, all over the world, of people using the same methodology that started in Vietnam.
Wow, very interesting. I just recently checked the map, and my hometown's score very high. So
which one's your hometown?
It's Hue City. Hue.
Yeah, Hue City does well. Not always. In the early years, they didn't do well, and then they sort of moved up. They're one of the big improvers in the index over time. Yeah.
Yeah, I am so surprised. Like the Hue City now is like score higher than the Hanoi City.
But so that was the whole point of the index, right? Because people were confusing having a large business sector with having good governance, right? But Hanoi has a whole bunch of advantages. It's a capital, has more universities, has better infrastructure. So of course it has a larger market. So, but that doesn't mean that Hanoi necessarily has the best governance, right? So what we wanted to do was create a measure of governance that was separate from just having a large business for provinces like Hue. Because no matter what Hue does, it can't move any closer to Ho Chi Minh City than it already is, right? So like, geography is a structural factor, but what can a province like Hue do short of, given the fact that it can't change its endowment? So yeah. So it's been really interesting over the years. The provinces that have done really well are Binh Duong province was one of the early successful provinces, ranked really high. Then Da Nang topped the rankings for a number of years. And most recently, Quang Ninh province has been the highest ranked province for the last few years.
I have a follow-up question. I'm looking at Hue's ranking, and on the website, very nice historic. You can see historically as well. And Hue is currently number 6 in 2022. But before that, they were like number 30s, and they improved a lot over the past, let's say, 3 years. So then what would be the kind of like the driver for a city to improve like that? And then is that the quality of the leadership in place, or people take that index seriously and wanted to improve certain metrics, or like what would drive the improvement? And can you see that kind of like anything tangible from the index perspective? So let's say it was number 30 2 years ago and now it's number 6. Does it mean that like you can see the changes in real life, or is that take a long time for you to see the improvement?
Yeah, no, okay. So there's a lot of good questions there. So number one, I tend to see 3 things that make differences when provinces suddenly start to improve. Like, so one is a change in leadership, right? You get a new leader that cares about the index, that cares about the private sector, it really wants to drive things. And you can see that because like Vietnam has regular promotion cycles, right? Like, so every 5 years you get some new leaders in different places and you can see the trajectory over time. I also see it driven by businesses, like foreign companies move into an area and start asking for changes to transparency, and that spills over to if foreign companies are asking for certain things and certain governance changes, those tend to spill over into the domestic private sector community too. So you see that sort of advocacy causing changes. The third thing is diffusion from other provinces. So like one of the things is you'll see is like clusters of provinces, like the Mekong Delta. Is a lot of the provinces in the Mekong Delta are ranked really high. And the reason is because they share ideas about how to improve. So over time, leaders of provinces travel, leaders of provinces get together, they share ideas about, okay, you're doing one land certificates, tax payments, business registration. I want to create a building like that too. So you start to see those ideas sort of diffuse, which leads to changes over time. And yeah, we've been doing a lot of analysis recently on what it means, what happens when you change. And that's been really fascinating too. The provinces, so there is a very strong correlation between improvements in governance and then subsequent changes in economic performance in terms of new business registrations and in terms of greater investment. Because now we have almost 20 years of data to look at what happens when provinces make governance changes. And in fact, I can even tell you which changes matter the most. One, the biggest changes that have the biggest impact on performance are transparency, making documents available, making land maps available, making infrastructure available, because that allows businesses to know and make intelligent forecasting about their strategic plans. And so that has had a big change overall. More recently, we've seen, as the anti-corruption campaign has been going on, we've seen that provinces that have done the most to reduce corruption have also had big performances. So last year, the highest weighted index, we reweight the indexes based on their impact, and the highest weighted index was the informal charges index, sub-index.
Well, from your explanation, we can see that this index has been playing a very instrumental role in supporting the growth, the Vietnam market. And obviously, we see that, foreign investors have been using the index to kind of evaluate the market, the investing landscape of Vietnam. And we did an episode with, the former CIO of Dragon Capital. He used to mention that transparency is one of very high core value that could drive more FDI investment and then more capital inflows into Vietnam. And then just really consistent with the point that you shared earlier about, which sub-indexes are really driving the change, the move in the ranking of these provinces. And I guess, my question for you is, beside this PCI index, what are some of the other metrics that, foreigners, investors, or like people, or like officials in other countries could look at to kind of evaluate the growth of, provinces in Vietnam, or just like on a bigger scale, Vietnam in general, beside the PCI?
Yeah. When I'm talking to foreign investors, so the PCI measures governance, and governance is one part of their calculation. I would say like a 5-part sort of thinking. So the first part is like, depending on their sector, they may have to go to a certain place, right? Like, so they need to be close to natural resources, or if they are they're a hotel, they need to be in a resort area. So some of it's just driven by the sectoral needs that they have. And by the way, in the PCI data, we've started creating a separate measure of infrastructure. We don't put it in the index, but we have our own infrastructure index, because infrastructure and quality of infrastructure has become really important for investors. They want high quality roads, they want high quality connectivity in terms of access to ports and airports, because there's a lot of waste that comes from broken or damaged goods or on poor infrastructure, or waste or spoiled goods because of long waiting times. So quality of infrastructure has been a big deal. Depending on the industry, businesses have also been concerned about human capital in Vietnam. So, Vietnam has, really excellent elementary education, secondary education, very good. But investors have sort of struggled in Vietnam until recently about getting the type of high quality labor that matched their sector's needs. So like Vietnam has this great, very talented workforce that's highly literate. Like I think Vietnam's literacy rate is 97% right now. And that's been really good for early development. But businesses that are coming in now that are more interested in more technological production, higher value added production, have wanted higher quality workers that were able of doing those higher level tasks. And so finding technical people, finding high quality managers, finding high quality accountants, and even not even those high level skills, but just basic vocational skills that match the needs of the businesses have been an issue. And that provinces that have done a better job of developing local university training and vocational training that match the needs of those investors have also done good. So I would say that that's sort of the dimensions that they're looking at is sector specific, infrastructure, human capital, and then the final one is the governance dimension of it.
So I think, yeah, all of the factors that you pointed out made total sense to me. And I want to touch on the last one, which is human capital. You know, the three of us, and then also among our friend groups, we've been talking a lot about these recent chip deal, you know, the Intel, and then also the growing relationship between Vietnam and US. And obviously there's been more promise about more investment from the US into Vietnam, into the semiconductor industry. And we also, you know, talked about how whether we're ready, you know, in terms of like talent side, do we have enough supply in order to feed into those many factories that's, you know, being built in Vietnam. And you touched on that. So I feel like in order to capture that growth, either we need to have a better vocational facility, or, you know, whether the government or to do somehow to attract more talent. You know, I know that there's a lot of Vietnamese talent overseas that's working for these high-tech companies. So we need to attract and bring more of those talent back home. What do you think of the community of Vietnamese overseas that are working in, you know, developed country like the United States, Canada, Australia, or, you know, country in the European? Do you see potential there? If they're coming back, they could make a great impact for Vietnam, that could push Vietnam move forward much faster?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think there's so much talent abroad in terms of the Vietnamese, overseas Vietnamese community, but also Vietnamese students that have gone up to bring back in so many different sectors. So for a long time, I was actually in 2013, President Obama appointed me to this thing called the Vietnam Educational Foundation, which provided scholarships for Vietnamese to study science and technology focused PhDs or masters in the US. And they ended up training, you know, several hundred young students in all of these fascinating technical fields to come back. So I also want to be optimistic too. Like I think there's a lot of things going on in Vietnam too, to improve the educational system, right? So you now have, in addition to the famous, you know, state universities, but now you've got a bunch of great private universities, Fulbright University in the South. You've got Vinh University that's starting to take on students. You've got other foreign universities. So I think some of that's going on. FPT, technology companies started their own high-tech university. And it's not just in the big cities either. You know, there's this great economist. His name's Khoa Vu. He's an American economist. And his job market paper was really neat. So in between 2010 and 2014, Vietnam had an expansion campaign of regional universities where they were encouraging smaller provinces, right? Like in Thái Nguyên and Tiền Giang, and giving them resources to start smaller universities out in these more rural provinces. And when he looks at those places that received universities, not just the province, but the district that those universities were in had higher levels of productivity, higher levels of entrepreneurship in the years following. Like the students that graduated, that cohort that were given the age to go to the university, were much more likely to start businesses and be successful. And all of this, I think, is really important because right now, Vietnam is sort of the beneficiary of a whole bunch of forces that we can talk about that's driving a lot more investment into the country right now. So, you know, like last year, Vietnam had a historic year in terms of investment attraction. But the question is, and I think you're exactly right about this, Phu, is like, does Vietnam have the absorptive capacity to be able to train the workers of the future for those future industries.
So you mentioned about there's a lot of force beside that. I'm really curious. After you said that, I'm really curious about those forces. Would you mind to talk a little bit more about the forces that are driving more foreign direct investment or FDI into Vietnam, and what sector that you thinking that is going to be benefit the most from those FDI and the intention?
Yeah. For many years, companies that were investing in China had what was called a China plus one strategy. I always think of it kind of like an insurance contract, right? Like, so they had a lot of their supply chain, like a Korean conglomerate had a lot of their supply chain in China, but then a small amount in Vietnam. And the idea was that if there was an issue, that they would be able to shift investment over into Vietnam, or sometimes other countries too were involved in this. Since the Trump tariffs of 2018 placed higher tariffs on a whole range of products, what you've seen is a lot of investment in those tariff products entering Vietnam, right? On a massive scale, like almost doubled the amount of investment in some of the high-tech industries that have moved into Vietnam. So yeah, so I think that's one big thing. The second big thing is that Vietnam's labor costs, so we've already talked about high-quality labor. Vietnam's labor costs are still much lower than China. Vietnamese labor is much more skilled than other countries, than its neighbors, but also much lower cost than China. And so that's been another driver, is these costs. So you've seen those sort of two big forces driving a large amount of investment into Vietnam. And as you guys know, it was originally Vietnamese, the foreign investment in Vietnam was pretty low end foreign investment, right? It was either very sort of garment production or light electronics production or assembly, right? Like you would develop all the parts of a motorcycle, but the final thing would be put together in Vietnam like a kit. But what's happened over the past few years is Vietnam has become like a major destination for higher tech investment. So you've seen Vietnamese higher level electronics, computers, advanced chemicals have all been growth industries in Vietnam. So over the past few years. And so that, as I said, part of this has been driven by the trade war. Some other factors that have mattered is Vietnam managed COVID better than most other countries in the world and was able to open up faster to other places. So you saw that advantage of Vietnam being able to do this. So all of it sort of, this is kind of a sort of a boom opportunity for Vietnamese foreign investors. The question I think that Phu asks is, does Vietnam have the absorptive capacity to be able to handle this right now? Do they have the infrastructure in place? Do they have the training? Do they have enough people to be able to manage the tremendous flows that are coming in right now?
So I think the same question, those you just mentioned, is also applied for semiconductor. So from the Vietnam side, I believe semiconductor has been one of the top sector that the government has been cared about in the last few months. And then also the fact that Vietnam's, in case that the audience that they don't know, Vietnam actually have the second largest reserve on Earth of rare earth element that supports the semiconductor and also the magnet industry. Just second, we have as much of China's had. It's also unlocked a huge potential of that industry in Vietnam. So I'm curious if you come across any research or any conversation with other experts about how Vietnam can benefit from the CHIPS Act and from the huge potential in terms of resource from the semiconductor growth.
Yeah, when you ask that question, like, of course, you know that, semiconductors were so important to the growth of Singapore and Taiwan, in their early years. So definitely semiconductors are, an important, policymakers are thinking about it. When Joe Biden visited Vietnam recently to sign the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership, so the advancement in their foreign policy, like if you read the documents that came out of it from the U.S. side, one of the big things was joint cooperation on the development of semiconductor industry, right? So the U.S. was thinking about connecting, we connecting U.S. companies to Vietnam in this. And at that time, Intel, the big U.S. chips company, already has a major factory and has had one for many years in Saigon, decided that, announced that it would expand its investment. There are definitely groups that are thinking about that right now. Interestingly, it turned out that Intel ended up delaying that investment. And I do think that the real question comes back to, does Vietnam right now have enough trained workers to be able to work in that sector, right? But the idea is right. Vietnam has the natural resources. It would be very easy to locate factories that would be in close proximity to those resources, which would reduce transportation costs. Vietnam has a large enough population, and it's really about the training of those high quality workers, technical workers, to be able to do it.
I totally agree with that. I think Vietnam have a lot of advantages, especially like the open relationship and also the tight relationship with the semiconductor fabrication country like Japan and Korea, South Korea, and also like Europe. We have, like tax benefit and from the partnership program with those regions. So I think that Vietnam can be a great area for further development in that sector. Another follow-up question, when you touch on the labor for the semiconductor industry, what level of education that require mostly in that semiconductor industry? Is that going to be like high school literacy, or is it going to be like high tech college educated, or just overall like operation, machinery, industrial, college educated people?
So I think we're beyond my area of expertise right now, but I don't think Vietnam will have any trouble with the people that are doing the basic production of it. The question is going to be the higher level workers that are going to manage and repair the equipment, designers, the higher level managers. That's the question. For assembly, I think Vietnam will be okay. Like Intel has been doing for many years, has had a training program for that type of work. So I think it is going to be more than high school education for the type of workers that they're going to need.
I think take a step back on, you mentioned the comprehensive strategic partnership announcement between Vietnam and the US. Obviously, that's a very big news for both Vietnam, the US, and have a lot of implications. So it would be great if you can provide us with a high level view on like the potential implication on the relationship between Vietnam and United States, and also between the three of Vietnam, United States, and China, whether that would have any implication on how China conducts relationship with the US and Vietnam.
Yeah, I mean, the US this has been something that has been talked about for a long time. Actually, it's interesting that for a long time, the US wanted a strategic partnership. The move to a comprehensive strategic partnership was kind of like an extra notch, more than the US been asking for. And it was to the level that, only 5 other countries in the world had, right? Like, including China. So it basically raised the US to the diplomatic relationship of China or India. I think it's a big boom in terms of what's possible, in terms of cooperation that the countries can work on together. So we've already talked about the technology side and the investment side. I think you're going to see a lot more cooperation on environmental questions. So Vietnam, of course, signed the Just Energy Transition Partnership. That's of great importance to the US and of great importance to Vietnam, because it's high growth, but is creating demands on the Vietnamese economy. They have huge energy demands, but at the same time, Vietnam is one of the countries most exposed to climate change. So Vietnam clearly needs to change its energy mix. So, that is something that the countries can work on together. You're going to see more cultural and educational relationships between the two countries. Vietnam practices this bamboo diplomacy, right? Like Vietnam doesn't want to be aligned too closely with any country, doesn't want to be dependent too closely on one country. I think that at various times, Vietnam has thought that it was too dependent on China economically and has looked for ways to diversify that relationship. But I don't think, some people have read this as this is Vietnam shifting to the US in some sort of game. But it doesn't appear to me to be like that at all, that Vietnam improved its relationship with the US, but at the same time, Vietnam is also working on its relationship with China, right? And it was, Xi Jinping will be visiting Hanoi in a few years. They are in different ways. They already had a comprehensive strategic partnership, but are upgrading their relationship in different ways. I think Vietnam has sort of an overall multilateral strategy. The relationship between China and the U.S., I do think, is complicated, right? It's clear that they have moved from, kind of strategic, like cooperative partners to more rivals. And we have this sort of ongoing trade conflict. The Trump administration put a bunch of tariffs, but the Biden administration did not remove those. The Biden administration has tried to put in place this Indo-China Pacific Economic Framework. So in Vietnam, I think, is in a critical role here in terms of how the U.S. is seeing its relationships in the Asian region, right? The U.S. would really like to be able to work more closely with Vietnam to balance against activities from China. And I think there the two countries have some interest, especially when it comes to interest about navigation in the Eastern Sea.
I'm still very curious about something you shared earlier, back in the years that you first arrived to Vietnam and, teaching statistics, right? You mentioned that you were really hands-on with state-owned enterprises. You were teaching statistics, you were teaching them how to think about the market, how to, basically doing business in a market-driven society, right? So I'd love to learn more about at the same time, it was also when Vietnam kind of trying to establish its stock market, the Ho Chi Minh City Stock Exchange, went into operation in 2000. I think Hanoi was in 2005. So around the same time, the PCI went into effective. So can you speak to the evolution, the growth and development of, I guess, publicly listed companies and state-owned enterprises, the roles those two group of entities have been playing in terms of contributing to the growth of Vietnam ever since that point? I guess it's been 15 plus years now.
So I mean, it's complicated, right? But so in those early years when I was in Vietnam, there was a very small private sector, and it was even called the private sector. It was called the non-state sector, right? So this was pre-2000. It was very difficult to start a private business. And the big beneficiaries at the time of the economic reforms had been the state-owned enterprises, right? Because Vietnam had liberalized its economy in a number of ways. It's liberalized agriculture, liberalized prices, but the state-owned companies still existed, still had easier access to capital, still had easier access to land. At that time, Vietnamese policymakers were still not, they had come out of a communist ideology. They were still not entirely sure about the market, and there was kind of a lot of testing that was going on. And the decision that Vietnam made that was more like China than in Eastern Europe was to say, we'll allow the private sector and foreign sector to enter, right? In already very early in Vietnam in 1987, you had a foreign investment law, but we're not going to necessarily right away privatize the state-owned enterprises. We're going to allow the state-owned enterprises to compete against the private sector, right? So they didn't have a big state-owned enterprise reform program. Later on, they would, right? And we'll talk about that in a second. The big important law, for me, and I think the most important law, and when people think about the history of economic reform in Vietnam, I think they sometimes miss this. They talk about Doi Mui and they talk about foreign investment, but the big thing was called the enterprise law, and it came out in 2000. And the enterprise law essentially legalized private sector activity, right? To some extent, it came about because of negotiations with the U.S. about the U.S. bilateral trade agreement, but I think it was more domestically driven by sort of a response to the Asian financial crisis. And what it did was it removed a whole bunch of regulations to streamline entry. And more important, it was a philosophy. Right before in Vietnam, before 2000, if you wanted to do business, you had to get a certification and a license, and you had to be proved in a bunch of different industries. But the enterprise law basically said, if you have a good idea, you can do it unless it's in these excluded areas. And all you have to do is register. So they moved from a certification system to a registration system. And the boom is tremendous, right? So you have 15,000 non-state firms, formal non-state firms before 2000. and then 200,000 5 years after, right? And now you have almost 800,000 formally private registered enterprises. And that's the most dynamic sector. And when you think about in Vietnam, what is creating the room for labor, who are hiring the workers, who are the interesting businesses, that's really the interesting is these small and medium-sized enterprises that have boomed after the enterprise law. And I sometimes think that gets missed as we try and tell the other story in Vietnam. But yeah, so the second sort of big thing that happened with the state-owned enterprises was, for a variety of reasons in Vietnam, that to some extent had to do with the legacy of the war. So during the war, because so much bombing activity was taking place, so many places were being destroyed, state-owned enterprises were sort of spread out throughout the country, sort of to protect them, right? So entering the reform era, you had a lot of really tiny state-owned enterprises all over the country. They weren't very productive. And so what sort of the first big thing that Vietnam did was sort of merge them together into these sort of large conglomerates, and then started a program called equitization. And equitization was not privatization, right? They were selling shares of the enterprises, but not necessarily relinquishing control. And so then what you saw in the early development of the stock market was a number of the companies listed were these equitized state-owned enterprises, ones that had their shares come from state to the private sector. So that, in the early days of the Vietnamese stock market in Saigon and Hanoi it was cowboy land, right? It was there, they were still sort of figuring out the rules. It was very difficult. You had people front running their own, like brokers front running their own investors. You had all sorts of activities that were going on. But I think it's become a more professional, more formal system. You still have some of the listed state-owned enterprises and state banks that are listed there, but now you have a number of very successful private companies that are also listed on the stock market too, that investors can invest in.
Thank you for the answer. And you did mention about Vietnam's potential, and then a lot of factories potentially moving to Vietnam, potentially higher value activities on top of those activities that are lower value moving to Vietnam. And I found it strikingly similar to the growth model of China, when they call themselves the factory of the world, right? So then China have been doing kind of similar activities, and they do a lot of high-tech manufacturing. They do a lot of manufacturing activities, and that's the engine for their growth. So then could you give us a comparison, contrast the difference between Vietnam and China's economic model, and whether there's a potential for Vietnam to achieve the same miraculous growth as China in the past?
Yeah. I mean, look, so I think over the past 30 years, Vietnam's already the second fastest growing country in the world besides China. I mean, Vietnam already has its own miracle, right? Yeah, I think it's worth thinking about. In the early 90s, when I first started thinking about Vietnam, at that time, close to 90% of people live below the poverty level, right? And that number today is 8%, right? Some parts of the country are worse, but the idea that so many, millions and millions of people have been lifted out of poverty in this, so I already think that Vietnam is to some extent a tremendous economic miracle already. So, yeah, I think that the second is Vietnam is very different from other countries around the world in the sense that it is having this manufacturing export-led growth right now. I think there's a few things. Vietnam is more dependent on foreign investment than China ever was, right? Right now, foreign investors are responsible for close to 70% of Vietnamese manufacturing exports. Samsung alone is a big chunk of that, right? So one thing that Vietnam has not done that China had already started to do was develop champions of its own, domestic Vietnamese companies that were capable of exporting and competing. Vietnam is still very much a foreign investor-driven economy, and Vietnamese policymakers are aware of that. They've tried to figure out how to connect domestic companies to international supply chains. They've tried to figure out how to structure incentives that would develop large manufacturing. But right now, Vietnam is heavily dependent on foreign exporters that way. Yeah, but I do think that the one thing that's definitely true is Vietnam is moving up the value chain in terms of what's produced in Vietnam, in terms of the quality of goods, in terms of the margins that Vietnam was able to get out of it. Vietnam has not though, gotten close to China level of productivity. And that, I think that matters. So even though Vietnam's labor costs are much lower, Chinese productivity is much higher. Part of that. And of course, Vietnam is about the size of a medium-sized Chinese province. Like the entire country of Vietnam, like China's still huge, right? So Vietnam will never be able to have the scale that China will be able to have. And when I think about Vietnam's success, like I think Vietnam is going to will be much more like Taiwan or a Korea, right, than a China in terms of where it's going to go. And it's much smaller, but it seems to me that Vietnam has also emulated the Singaporean model of economic growth.
I think you made a great point about developing local champion. And we saw Chinese companies starting making waves in the BYD in the EV industry, for example, currently dominating the EU market. So I saw Vietnam already started to, like, at least they start trying to do that with an example of VinFast going public in the US and trying to do a factory in the US and all that. But my question is more high level on what's your view on Vietnam trying to develop those champions? Like, what are the bottlenecks and whether Vietnamese companies can compete globally or can have a global recognizable names on the map? Because currently we don't have any, right? So what's your view on that and how can we improve our local companies to become champions?
Yeah, a few that I can think of, right? Like that have successfully, so Viettel obviously has done well in other countries selling to telecommunications abroad. Becamex, the big Bing Duong company, has gotten involved in international investments and has done okay. And then Vingroup, so we know VinFast, they've been involved in some other activities as well. There's some issues here, I think, so one is, I think big questions for Vietnamese is, why is the Vietnamese market dominated by these big conglomerates, that private conglomerates that do really well in real estate and then move into restaurants and then move into motorcycle production? Why are they investing in so many different industries and not developing their core competency and trying to get better and better at a smaller set of industries so that they can compete abroad? What is it about the Vietnamese incentive structure that allows the successful entrepreneurs decide to spread out sort of across a number of different, very different spaces? The second thing is, what is it about the Vietnamese system that keeps companies from developing scale, right? Like even some of the really successful manufacturers in Vietnam have really been restrained in terms of their scale. What is it about that? What is it about the governance structure? What is it about the legal system? To some extent, I have always thought it has something to do with the legal system, that, Vietnamese courts, not a lot of investors, for whatever reason, feel comfortable with Vietnamese courts. They get worried a bit if they have a case that goes to a Vietnamese court that they might not be treated fairly. And so one of the things that keeps their scale relatively small is they do business with a smaller set of partners for whom they have some sort of social relationship or who they trust. Yeah, so you have these very large companies in Vietnam, but not able to build scale. And one of the really fascinating things for me is that they don't decide to invest in a core competency. They decide to invest across a range of different activities. And then even the businesses, like where you have large manufacturing business they tend to stay a relatively small scale. And I think there, a key issue has to do with the Vietnamese legal system, that investors don't trust courts, don't like their cases to go to courts, do everything they can to avoid courts, and as a result, end up doing business with a smaller circle of groups, which, they don't trust enough people, and that tends to keep their scale relatively small. And then the final thing I'll say is, I think some investors, whether they're right or wrong, think that it's not a good idea to be big in Vietnam, that being big in Vietnam draws attention to you. It might make people are going to pay more attention to your taxes, that you might be a target. And so some businesses avoid that. And so I think all of these sort of have conspired together to keep businesses from developing the type of internationally competitive companies that are necessary. Like, if someone listened to me in Vietnam and I was able to influence policymakers, like I would say, like, I really think you should do everything you can to create an independent court system that allows for people to feel competent in dispute resolution. You should unleash as much as you can, move the state out of most decision making and allow the companies to compete against each other vigorously in Vietnam, so that you actually do get some champions that can compete abroad. Like, you should think about what Korea looked like in the 80s and how Korea worked to develop its competitive companies by first creating a very competitive market within Korea and then unleashing those companies in the world. But right now, Vietnam is just not in the same place as these other countries in terms, because it is highly, highly foreign investment dependent.
I love it. When we lost you on the signal, then I talked to Vu and Phu that you know about Vietnam a lot better than we do as Vietnamese. So I love your sharing so far.
Oh, I don't know about that.
No, you do.
Yeah.
You are. Compared to three of us, I think you know about Vietnam a lot better than we do. So we appreciate your sharing, and there's a lot of good point there. The next question I want to ask is like, with those advantages and disadvantages, and like there's a few international firm, as you mentioned, is going to be Viettel, is going to be APT, is going to be a lot of big corporation, new technology corporations try to compete in the infrastructure level, in the application level, even the manufacturing level globally. What do you think the short-term economic outlook for Vietnam with those competitors, with those players, with those champions in the next few years? And if longer, if you want to have to make a guess, then what would be your estimation, your forecasting, for your speculation for the future of Vietnam's economic in the long term?
It's a really hard question. It's a harder question than you think, Chief, because I think right now I'm looking at the constellation of power in Vietnam and looking at the decision makers in Vietnam, and I feel like I don't fully understand their intentions right now. I feel very confident about Vietnamese entrepreneurs. I feel very confident about young people in Vietnam. I feel very comfortable in the dynamism and creativity of the people working in the Vietnamese private sector. But I don't feel that I totally understand the long-term strategy right now of the current Vietnamese leadership. Yeah, I mean, as you probably know, this past year was a tough year in Vietnam. So Vietnam in 2022 grew at over 8%, right? Like historically high, like Asian miracle level growth. But 2023, it looks like Vietnam's going to finish the year with 3.4% GDP growth. And you will have seen real difficulties in a number of areas in Vietnam. Part of it's external. Part of it has to do with the war in Ukraine. Part of it has to do with economic issues in China, the trade war between China and the US. But part of it has to do with issues in Vietnam that have to do with the anti-corruption campaign, the freezing of the real estate market. So it is a very uncertain time right now. So I'm so worried about making a prediction. I'm like sort of dancing around your question here because I feel like no matter what I say, I'm going to be wrong here, right? But this is what I'm currently thinking, right? That one of the things that's going on right now is the anti-corruption campaign. We haven't even talked about it, right? But as you know, like thousands of officials have been arrested, right? And it's not like an elite political thing. Like people like to say, oh, this is just politics. No, it's like every different group in Vietnam that you can imagine has had people arrested. Like some of the top leaders in Vietnam, 2 deputy prime ministers, the president of Vietnam have lost their positions as a result of this anti-corruption campaign. They've now started to go after some of the biggest business leaders in Vietnam, right? AIC, company. And then all of this has led to some slowdowns in Vietnam, right? So why? Why are we seeing slowdowns? It's really interesting, right? People are afraid to make decisions right now in Vietnam because they're afraid of ending up on the wrong side of the law. Like right now, Vietnam has not spent 30% of its budget for the year because local officials are afraid to do government procurement because they're afraid that government procurement will end up being corrupt, right? Or thinking that they're corrupt, right? So there's like this whole, so Vietnam is trying to figure out how to deal with this problem. So, and what I think is going to happen, and I don't know whether it's going to happen in the short or medium term. So in general, I think that this is a good thing for Vietnam. I think that the anti-corruption campaign is rooting out corruption. It was a major problem in Vietnam. And I think that it's good that someone's finally dealing with it. But on the other hand, I think that the anti-corruption campaign came before fundamental changes in the institutions. And so right now what you're seeing is people not knowing how to adjust to the new environment, right? Both businesses and government officials. And it's going to take a while for the Vietnamese leadership to develop the institutions and processes that people trust and feel comfortable with, and that businesses know how to operate within. And I don't think that I'm saying anything that's surprising to Vietnamese authorities. Like, I think they understand that, right? Because, you know, they're trying to move all of the administrative procedures and services online to create a massive e-governance system. Why? Because that takes discretion out of the hands of officials. So they're trying to move towards more formal institutionalized processes, but they're not there yet. And so until they get there, where they have these sort of clear sets of institutions and rules that people understand how to follow, we're going to have a little bit of slowness and issues in the Vietnamese system, because I think people are afraid to make decisions right now. Yeah, I think in the short and medium term, I'm not super optimistic. I think there's going to be some issues here and some gridlock and slowdown. I am very optimistic about the long term, because I think once you move towards e-governance, once you have put in place these foundations, businesses are going to understand how to operate within the system, and we will get more rapid economic growth. The question that you ask is, it sounds so simple, right? Like, ask an expert in Vietnam to make a prediction about next year. And like, I totally can't, right? It is really hard. And I think any person following Vietnam that's being honest right now would answer the same way, right? That this is just a time of real uncertainty.
Wow. Well, that's my reaction when listening. And your answer is just, in my opinion, I totally agree with you. There's going to be a lot of people who's just going to answer and see the market the same way. The reason why I feel wow is because I did not expect a foreigner, even like you spend a lot of time researching about Vietnam, but I don't expect a foreigner like know that much of an insight as much as any Vietnamese do. So I just love it. And then I wanted to let you know that I love your answer. Just a question I want to ask about that is, as a foreigner, where did you learn and gain the insight, those insights you just talked about? Do you know Vietnamese? Oh, you do. Oh, you do know Vietnamese. That's why. That's why. That's explain it.
Okay.
Yeah, I love it. I love it.
Yeah. I've been working in Vietnam for a long time. I work very closely with, important decision makers, and I work very closely with businesses. I am a foreigner, but I just feel like I see the problems in a very real way, because I'm, on the ground trying to measure the problems and then trying to figure out how to solve them, so, and I feel like I've had a front row seat to a lot of the big policy decisions that Vietnam has had to make over the years. So I'm not going to say that I have the same level of expertise as a Vietnamese person, but I do feel like, I've been very grateful that a lot of Vietnamese people have trusted me, turned to me for advice, and given me opportunity to see them struggle with these decisions.
Yeah. There was a lot of insights from your previous answers, and I believe that heroes are made in time of crisis. And I personally think that this is a perfect time for Vietnam to do is detoxing or a cleansing of, in terms of like political or like anti-corruption, all of that initiatives. Because I think right now, as the world is like slowing down in terms of economic growing, there's not a lot of investment going on right now. So if Vietnam taking its time to do all of that cleansing and preparing itself for a more long-term sustainable growing, like you said, right? Removing all of the lags that the heavy waves are dragging the country back, so that maybe a couple of years later, we have better regulation in place, we have better infrastructure in place, that is when the economy, in the world is coming back. And then by the time foreign investors are more confident, are more comfortable making investment into Vietnam, and by the time we're more ready, capturing and capitalizing on that investment flows. I guess my question for you is, as we're transitioning back a little bit to your contribution to Vietnam, I learned that you were awarded a state medal for your contribution, right? I guess one of your high profile contribution is the PCI index. Could you speak more to some of your other work, some of the other contributions that people might not have known, but you're also very proud as well that, could have, behind the scenes contributed to the growth of our country?
I mean, I'm a researcher, right? So like all my accomplishments are research accomplishments. The other thing that I helped create was Vietnam's biggest public opinion survey with the UNDP. So that surveys citizens, right? The PCI surveys businesses, but it surveys citizens. It's called the POPI survey. And it surveys this year 19,000 citizens, including migrants, right? Internal migrants, about their views about the government, about satisfaction with services. And so I'm very proud of that. I've done a lot of work with the Vietnamese National Assembly, on responsiveness of delegates, how delegates acquire information, whether delegates are paying attention to what their citizens say. And I found that that work has been really exciting. My big project, my I Save the World project, my post-tenure project, you probably see this all the time. Do you guys come back to Vietnam a lot? So you see that a lot of companies don't follow basic safety regulations, right? Have you ever been you see you walk down the street, you see the electric wires, right, that are sort of loose, right? You see a construction site and you see that there's not the basic construction safety. Or just think about how many fires have happened in Vietnam just recently, karaoke places, right? Okay, so I had for a long time wondered how do you get, and it's not the big foreign companies or the big state companies that are not following. They're following because everybody's watching them. It's the hundreds of thousands of formal companies or the millions of informal companies that are never investigated, never inspected, and don't think they ever will. And so they don't bother to follow these safety regulations. And so I wonder, well, how do you protect Vietnamese? How do you, so if you remember a few years ago, there was a big factory collapse in Bangladesh that killed over 400 people. And I really worried that something like that might happen in Vietnam. And so I worked with the Ministry of Labor and some co-authors to try a bunch of techniques to see how could we get companies to comply with safety regulations, even without knowing that without inspections. And one of the things that we did was we gave those companies a chance to participate in the drafting of the regulations. So we did a randomized experiment. So some companies got to participate in drafting a new chemical safety regulation and others did not. And then we followed them a year later after the regulation came out and found that the companies that had helped draft the regulation were much more likely to be in compliance. Even though they were never inspected, they were more likely. And we're talking about real safety violations, not putting reactive chemicals together in the same storage unit or not having chemicals close to open flames from welding equipment. They were much more likely to be in compliance. So there, I feel that was a really important finding for academia, but also for Vietnam about how to improve regulatory compliance. So I'm really proud of that too, I guess. Yeah. So yeah, I remain tremendously proud every time I see some of the ideas from the PCI end up as policy, right? When I see that ideas from one-stop shops from the PCI became policy, when I see ideas about how to gather information from companies, provinces started to use them. So those are all things that I'm really, I'm super proud of. Yeah.
I think one of the themes from our interview today, and one of your expertise as well, is learning about governance structure of companies, learning about how to improve transparency and just a disclosure. And as you mentioned, right, there's a lot of risk in investing in Vietnam. Like we don't know even public companies. Recently, you probably already know about the case of SCB, which is a publicly listed bank, one of the top 10 banks by asset in Vietnam. Big embezzlement case and huge conflict of interest. It's a bank that is regulated in Vietnam and also publicly listed, and they disclose the asset and financial to investors and still have those crazy issues related to embezzlement and conflict of interest, right? So then my question is, what's your thoughts on that, and how do we improve? And first, like, what's the impact on the potential? What sort of implication of that? And second, how can we improve that? Because it's an issue with a publicly listed company in a regulated industry, and there's still a big issue. So then how do investors even get comfortable with investing in this environment? How can companies kind of like take the next step of being more transparent and improve the disclosures to get people comfortable in investing?
This case is insanity. This case it's going to end up being what? $12.5 billion that was embezzled from Saigon Commercial Bank. This is going to be maybe the largest corruption scandal in the history of the world, right? Like larger than 1MDB in Malaysia, right? It is.
It's larger than the FTX club.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's crazy. And the fact that, so this is tycoon Chung Milan, like somehow controlled 90% of the shares of Saigon Commercial Bank and essentially used this as their own ATM, used the depositors' money as their own ATM, taking out that money to do loans of her own all over, not just in Vietnam, but in other countries, including Hong Kong. Yeah, I mean, and I think what you're saying, like, is the crazy part is, like, it was listed, it was regulated. The State Bank of Vietnam, there were regulators on the State Bank of Vietnam that were arrested because they were bribed to look the other way. It's very clear that the idea that could happen is very problematic. But the way I think about it is this, right? So there's sort of two views right now. There's the view that says, look, this is just revealing all of the corruption in Vietnam, that this is the rot at the core of the system, right? For me, I'm more sanguine about this, because for me it is, this was discovered, she was caught, the regulators that approved this and allowed this to happen were arrested. Vietnam is moving to a new place. There have been corruption cases like this in the past that we don't know about, that were not discovered, right? So this is a place where but you're right, I agree that it's not enough to just arrest her or the people that were involved. It's not enough to have just a big show trial on television. The next step is clear procedures and accountability so it doesn't happen again, right? So that what are the rules? What are the things that people have to follow? And what are going to be the punishments? Putting those rules very clearly in place so that people don't take the risk. It's an eye-watering number, but sort of I'm glad to know that Vietnam's getting a handle on it now, these types of activities, because I think we all know that there have been these activities in Vietnam for a long time. The scale of this is staggering, obviously. I'm not going to minimize the scale of it.
Wow,
all right.
That was a lot. That was a lot of real talk. We really appreciate that. And then we also have the same reaction, and we love your sharing about your views and what you think about the issue. And I also hope that the issue is going to be resolved. There's going to be more, clear regulation and also more strict rules to protect the depository, protect the customer, protect people from losing a lot of money. So just to wrap up again, we learned that you know Vietnamese. We learned that you research a lot about Vietnam. So we just want to ask, like, what's your favorite dish in Vietnam?
So my favorite dish in Vietnam is a dish called mì Quang. So have you ever had it? It's from Da Nang. Yeah.
That's my hometown.
My wife pronounces it mì Quang. But yeah, so as you know, it's not like a soupy noodle dish like pho. It just has a little bit of liquid, but it has pork and these beautiful tasty noodles and this incredible sauce that goes with it. It is So delicious. And it used to be that you could only get it in Da Nang and Quang Nam. But now there's a bunch of chains that you can actually get. There's a couple of places to get in Hanoi and a few more to get it in Saigon. It's kind of spreading. Vietnamese are learning how delicious this dish is. So yeah, I'm a huge fan. So that dish I'll go out of my way for anytime. Actually, I have a funny story about the dish. My wife is from Da Nang, and she's very proud that she makes really, really good mi quang. And one time I was at a restaurant, a different restaurant that I didn't know that she knew the family of. And I ordered mi quang, and then I came home, and she was really mad at me, and I didn't know why. And it turned out that she was mad that I had ordered mi quang at a restaurant. I'd not eaten her mi quang, so she was jealous.
Favorite restaurant in the state that sell mi quang? Because I've been looking for one, but I haven't had any luck. You know, they've been all like okay, not like an amazing one.
No, I have not found a good place, like a good restaurant to get it at in the U.S. I think maybe outside of D.C., you know, in that Virginia Eden complex, I think I had it there once, but we like to have it at home here. So, but in Da Nang, there's a ton of good places to get it, right? Like, there's like probably hundreds. You know. My favorite places in Da Nang is number 2 Haiphong Street. That's the place to go. So if you're ever in Da Nang, go to number 2 Haiphong Street. They have the best mi quang in the country.
I will be there next month, so I will definitely gonna try it out.
Okay, give it a shot. Yeah, and then you can report back on how it is. But you gotta go there early in the morning. Like, don't go there at like noon. It doesn't taste good then. You have to get it for breakfast in the morning when it's nice and hot. Yeah.
Wow, you know about the place that well. So I really want to ask you this question. So if an Americans ask you for an advice before they visit Vietnam, maybe like your friends or maybe your parents or some of your colleagues, they ask for advice before they go to Vietnam, what would it be? What were you gonna tell them? Like, prepare before they go?
Oh, I mean, what I like to do is advise people to go to the place. Like, you know, everybody likes to go to Vietnam, and they do this kind of trail of Saigon, Da Nang, Hoi An, Hue, Hanoi, Halong Bay, right? Like, and I try to advise people to go to places that are kind of off the beaten path, where you can get a sort of taste of Vietnam the way it used to be, right? Like, so like I like to tell people to go to Quy Nhon in Binh Dinh province, to go see like the beautiful rocky coastline and to have like the seafood. I like to tell people in the north to go to Pulum, to go see the old rice fields and get like to live in a little house near the rice field so you can see people farming in the morning. Like I like to sort of get people to the out of the way places so they can see the Vietnam that I used to know when I first got there in 1997. Yeah, I guess the second thing is, I don't know, this is a little bit of a risky thing, but I tend to tell people that Vietnamese people are very friendly, very nice, very interested in what I feel like it's a very welcoming country, and you get a lot of invitations. And I think sometimes people can be frightened sometimes by those invitations that people have to come over to dinner, to go have tea. And my advice has been, and I say this, it's a little risky, is to say yes. say yeah. If someone asks you to come over to dinner, say yes, right? If someone asks you to go get Sing Po with them, like say yes, because I think like every time I've done that, it's been a very positive experience for me. Like I've always felt like I've learned something new, met somebody interesting, learned about Vietnam in a different way I hadn't before. And so I think that's my sort of general, sort of way I live my life when I'm living there.
You speak Vietnamese to Vietnamese people?
Oh, học Vietnam 20 năm rồi mà.
Oh, wow.
Yes,
Thì nói tiếng Việt giỏi quá.
Rồi, học lâu rồi. Học lùi lắm nhưng mà học lâu rồi. Và khi làm việc, phải làm việc bằng tiếng Việt.
Oh,
wow. Wow.
Yeah, I don't know. But you know, there's lots of foreigners that speak Vietnamese better than me. So yeah.
So
well, I mean, like your Vietnamese is good enough to get all the insight of anyone. Yeah. Like, I don't think most of Vietnamese gonna know about Vietnam more than you, the average more than you do. So I think you is amazing.
I don't know about that, but like I do. But you have to remember, tonight I was having dinner with a bunch of young Vietnamese students, right? And it occurred to me, I have been in Vietnam longer than they have, right? Like I came to Vietnam in 1997. Like many of them were born post 2000, right? So so I have a long history with the country and I'm fascinated by it and really do love it. Well, I've lived in many different places in the US, but I lived in Hanoi for a long time.
Wow. Professor Malesky, we love the time spending time with you, and it was a very productive, effective conversation, and we appreciate your tie, your connection with Vietnam, and wish you all the best. I love the Joker, the chú tiểu, on your background. Yes, I noticed about that. I love your connection with to Vietnam, and wish you all the best. Just let us know if we can have anything. I know for sure the audience will appreciate your sharing. So thank you so much again. And
well, my pleasure. Yeah, great. Thanks for including me. I can't wait to hear it. And thank you guys for taking time. I know how busy you guys are you have your real job. So thank you for taking time out to do this. I think it's a really important service. So yeah, let me know how I can be helpful to you going forward too.
The work that you have done for Vietnam, to Vietnam, and your connection with the country. So thank you so much for being with us, and hopefully we can see you again soon.
Yeah, I hope so too. All right. Well, good night. Sleep tight, guys.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.